The medical tent smelled of blood and antiseptic, and Danny Cole moved between the cots with practiced efficiency, his slight limp barely slowing him down as he checked on wounded soldiers one after another. He had learned to ignore the whispers years ago, the ones that followed him like shadows whenever he walked through the camp. And today was no different, as two soldiers near the entrance muttered something about the cripple while pretending not to watch him. Work Danny simply adjusted the bandage on a young private's arm and offered the man a reassuring smile before moving to the next patient. The injury to his left leg had happened when he was just 12 years old. A training accident that the military doctors said would heal, but never did quite right. And by the time he was old enough to enlist, everyone told him he would never make it as a soldier. They were partly right, he supposed, because he could not run as fast as the others or carry as much weight on long marches. But what he lacked in physical ability, he made up for in other ways. His hands were steady and his mind was sharp. And he had graduated at the top of his class in field medicine, learning to save lives while others learned to take them. Lieutenant Karen Price entered the medical tent with her usual commanding presence, her boots making heavy sounds against the temporary flooring as she surveyed the rows of injured personnel. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and eyes that had seen too many battles, and she commanded the respect of everyone in the unit through sheer force of will and decades of experience. "How are they looking, Cole?" she asked, stopping beside him as he finished stitching a wound closed. "3 critical cases stabilized overnight," Danny reported, keeping his voice professional, "and the rest should be ready to return to duty within the week if they follow my instructions." Price nodded with what might have been approval before her expression grew serious. "We have a situation," she said, lowering her voice so only he could hear, "and I need you to come to the command center for a briefing." Danny followed her out of the tent and across the dusty ground of the forward base on Vera 7, a border planet that had become the front line in the ongoing conflict between the Galactic Alliance and the Calith Empire. The command center was a reinforced structure at the heart of the base, filled with holographic displays and communication equipment. And a dozen officers had already gathered when Danny and the lieutenant arrived. "Listen up," Price announced to the room, activating the main display to show a grainy image of a fortress built into the side of a mountain. "6 hours ago, we received a distress signal from Ambassador Thelix and her diplomatic convoy. A murmur went through the assembled soldiers as the image shifted to show a tall alien figure in ornate armor standing before a crowd of prisoners. "Commander Zyrith Warren," Price continued, her voice hard with barely contained anger. "The butcher of the Kethian colonies and the most brutal warlord in the Calith Empire captured the convoy as they were traveling through neutral space." Danny studied the image of Zyrith carefully, noting the cruel intelligence in the alien's 4 eyes and the way even his own soldiers seemed to fear standing too close to him. "What are his demands?" asked Corporal Luis Vega, Danny's closest friend in the unit, a communications specialist with a quick wit and quicker fingers on a keyboard. "He has no demands," Price answered grimly, "because he plans to execute the prisoners publicly in 12 hours as a demonstration of what he calls natural selection, killing them one by one, starting with whoever he considers the weakest." The room fell silent at this news, and Danny felt a cold knot form in his stomach as he thought about the innocent people trapped in that fortress. "Command has authorized a rescue mission," Price continued, "and I have been given discretion to assemble a team from this base." She began pointing to soldiers around the room, calling out names and assignments, and Danny waited to hear his own name, even though he knew some would object. "Cole, you are with us as field medic," Price said finally. And immediately a hand shot up from the back of the room. It belonged to Sergeant Nathan Drake, a muscular man who had never hidden his contempt for Danny's presence in the unit. "With respect, Lieutenant," Drake said in a tone that held very little actual respect. Are we really bringing dead weight on a mission this important? Danny kept his expression neutral, even as he felt the familiar sting of the words. But before he could respond, Lieutenant Price turned to face the sergeant with a look that could freeze plasma. Corporal Cole has saved more lives in this unit than your rifle has taken. Sergeant, she said coolly, and if any of us get wounded on this mission, you will be very glad he is there. So unless you have a medical degree I am not aware of, I suggest you keep your opinions to yourself. Drake's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. And Danny made a mental note to thank the lieutenant later when they were alone. Briefing continued with tactical details about the fortress and the surrounding terrain. And Danny paid close attention, even though his role would primarily be to patch up the wounded, rather than engage in direct combat when the briefing ended and the soldiers began to disperse to prepare their equipment. Louise fell into step beside Danny as they walked toward the armory. You know Drake is just jealous, Louise said with a grin. Because his idea of first aid is slapping some dirt on it and telling people to walk it off. Danny smiled despite himself, appreciating his friend's attempt to lighten the mood. I have been dealing with people like him my whole life, Danny admitted, and I stopped letting it bother me a long time ago. They reached the armory, and Danny began loading his medical kit with extra supplies. Knowing that a mission against the Caliph would likely result in casualties that needed immediate attention as he worked, he overheard two soldiers talking nearby. Their voices low, but not low enough to escape his hearing. 20 credits says the cripple does not make it back, one of them said with a laugh. Easy money, the other agreed. Because he will probably trip over his own feet before we even reach the fortress. Danny said nothing, simply continuing to check his supplies with careful precision, making sure every bandage and every vial of medicine was exactly where it needed to be. He had spent his entire life being underestimated, being written off, being told what he could not do. And he had learned that the best response was not words but actions. The shuttle that would carry them to the mission launched an hour later, and Danny sat quietly in his seat as the other soldiers talked and checked their weapons. The weight of his medical kit a familiar comfort against his side. Through the viewport, he could see the stars stretching out into infinity, and somewhere out there, innocent people were waiting to be saved by a team that included one small medic with a bad leg and something to prove, Lieutenant. Price caught his eye from across the shuttle and gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, and Danny nodded back, silently promising himself that he would not let her faith in him be misplaced, whatever waited for them in that fortress. Whatever Commander Zyrith Vorn had planned, Danny Cole would be ready. He had been underestimated his entire life, and he had learned to use that to his advantage. Because the enemy you dismiss is the enemy you never see coming. Zareth stared at the small human who had dared to challenge him, and despite the sedative fog clouding his mind, he began to laugh. It was a deep, rumbling sound that echoed through the chaotic hall, mixing with the sounds of battle as his warriors fought against the Alliance soldiers near the entrance. You? The commander sneered, taking a step toward Danny on legs that were not quite steady. A crippled human with a tiny blade thinks he can threaten me? Danny did not move, did not flinch, simply watched the massive warlord approach with eyes that remained calm and calculating. I have conquered a dozen worlds. Zyrith continued, his voice rising as he gestured around the hall with his ceremonial blade. I have killed warriors twice your size with my bare hands. I have crushed rebellions and ended bloodlines. And you think you can stand against me? He lunged forward with surprising speed, despite the sedative in his system, his blade cutting through the air where Danny's head had been a split second before. Danny barely managed to dodge, his bad leg screaming in protest as he threw himself to the side, and he rolled across the stone floor before scrambling back to his feet, fast for a cripple. Zyrith admitted with grudging surprise, but speed will only delay the inevitable. He attacked again, and this time his blade caught Danny's arm, opening a shallow cut that immediately began to bleed. The pain was sharp and immediate, but Danny had experienced worse during his training, and he forced himself to stay focused on the fight around him. The battle continued as Lieutenant Price and her team pushed deeper into the hall, freeing prisoners and engaging Caliph warriors who were sluggish and disoriented from the gas bud. Xyrath seemed to be fighting off the effects through sheer force of will, his enhanced physiology giving him a resistance that his soldiers lacked. "Why do you keep getting up?" the commander demanded as Danny dodged another strike. "You must know you cannot win. You must know this is pointless." Danny circled to his right, keeping distance between them while searching for an opening that might never come. "Humans have a saying," he replied, his breath coming in short gasps, "that it is not about how many times you get knocked down." Xyrath attacked again, a vicious combination of strikes that drove Danny backward toward the wall, and one blow caught him across the chest, sending him crashing to the floor. "Stay down," the commander ordered, standing over his fallen opponent with his blade raised, "and I will make your death quick as a reward for your courage." Danny coughed, tasting blood in his mouth, and every part of his body screamed at him to give up, to accept that he had done everything he could. But then he thought about the prisoners who were still not free, about Ambassador Thelix who had almost died, about every person who had ever told him he was worthless because of his bad leg, and he started to get up. Xyrath's eyes widened with disbelief as the small human slowly, painfully pushed himself off the floor and stood once more on shaking legs. "What is wrong with you?" the warlord demanded, genuine confusion in his voice. "Why do you not just accept defeat?" "Because that is not how humans work," Danny answered, blood dripping from his arm and his body swaying with exhaustion. "We do not measure strength by who can hit the hardest or who can run the fastest." He raised his surgical knife, a weapon that looked almost comical compared to Xyrath's massive blade. "We measure strength by who can get up one more time." He finished. Xyrath roared with fury and charged, putting all his remaining strength into a single devastating strike that would surely end the fight. But Danny had been waiting for exactly this moment, had watched the sedative slowly accumulating in Xyrath's system, had noticed the slight delay in the warlord's reactions growing longer with each attack, had calculated exactly how much the gas needed to affect him, and now, as Xyrath committed to his killing blow, Danny moved not fast, because he could never be fast with his injured leg, but precise. Using the medical knowledge that had been his greatest weapon all along, he slipped inside Xyrath's guard, close enough to feel the heat radiating from the alien's scaled body, and drove his surgical knife into the exact spot where he knew the Caliph nervous system was most vulnerable. It was a tiny wound, barely more than a pinprick compared to the injuries Xyrath had suffered in battle over the years. But the location was everything. The blade struck the nerve cluster in the commander's neck, severing connections that controlled motor function throughout the body. And Xyrath's eyes went wide with shock as his limbs suddenly refused to obey him. The ceremonial blade clattered to the floor as Xyrath's fingers lost their grip, and the mighty warlord followed a moment later, collapsing in a heap at Danny's feet. He was not dead, merely paralyzed, and his eyes burned with impotent rage as he stared up at the human who had defeated him. "How?" Xyrath managed to whisper, the only movement remaining to him the ability to speak. Danny knelt beside him, exhausted and bleeding but victorious, and looked into the eyes of the monster who had terrorized the galaxy. "You spent your whole life believing that strength was the only thing that mattered," Danny said quietly, "and you never bothered to learn that there are other kinds of power." He gestured to the chaos around them, to the Caliph warriors being subdued by Alliance forces, to the prisoners being freed from their chains. "You thought I was weak because I walk with a limp," Danny continued, "but I used that time to learn, to study, to understand things you never bothered to consider important." He tapped the small medical kit at his side. Every compound in here is meant to heal, he explained. But healing requires understanding how bodies work, how nerves connect, where the vulnerable points are. And that knowledge does not care how fast you can run or how much you can lift. Xerath's eyes blazed with hatred. But there was something else there too. Something that might have been the first crack in his absolute certainty. This changes nothing, the commander hissed. Because even if you kill me, another will take my place, and the Caliph way will continue. Danny shook his head slowly. Maybe, he admitted, but maybe not. Because right now, every one of your soldiers just watched their invincible commander get beaten by the weakest enemy on the battlefield. He looked up as Lieutenant Price approached, her weapon lowered as she surveyed the scene with undisguised amazement. And that is a lesson they will not forget. Danny finished from the shadows of a side chamber. Sub-Commander Rethus watched as the human medic was helped to his feet by his commanding officer, as the prisoners were gathered and escorted towards safety, as Xerath was carried away by Alliance soldiers to face justice for his crimes. The old order had fallen, brought down not by a mighty warrior or a cunning general, but by a small human with a bad leg and a surgical Neferethis. Thought about what that meant, thought about the philosophy he had followed for 15 years, and wondered if perhaps there was another way to build a future. The Caliph Empire would face difficult days ahead. But for the first time in his life, Rethus believed that change might actually be possible. Commander Xerath Vorn stood before his assembled warriors in the great hall of his fortress, his four eyes scanning the crowd with cold satisfaction as torchlight cast dancing shadows across the stone walls. Was massive even by Caliph standards. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, with scales the color of dried blood and muscles that rippled beneath his ceremonial armor. Whenever he moved, his voice echoed through the chamber like thunder as he addressed his followers. The universe operates on one simple truth, Xerath declared, raising a clawed fist above his head. And that truth is that the strong survive while the weak perish. As nature intended from the beginning of time, the warriors stomped their feet in approval, creating a rumbling that shook the floor. And Xerath smiled with teeth that could bite through steel. He had built his empire on this philosophy, rising from a minor commander to the most feared warlord in the sector through ruthless application of his beliefs. His own father had been the first test of his conviction. A former general who had grown soft with age and started speaking of peace with the Alliance's Xerath had challenged him in front of the entire clan and killed him with his bare hands, proving that even blood relations meant nothing when weakness was involved. Tonight, Xerath continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr, we will demonstrate our philosophy to the entire galaxy. And we will show them what happens to those who cling to weakness. He gestured to the guards at the far end of the hall, and massive doors swung open to reveal a line of prisoners. Being marched forward in chains, Ambassador Thelix walked at the front of the group, her blue-skinned face composed despite the fear that must have been churning inside her. And behind her came the rest of the diplomatic convoy, scholars and aides and security personnel who had been stripped of their weapon. Xerath descended from his throne and walked slowly among the prisoners, examining each one as if they were livestock being prepared for slaughter. Such a collection of specimens, he mused aloud, stopping before an elderly male with white hair and trembling hands. Tell me, old one, what is your purpose in this convoy? The elderly prisoner lifted his chin with what dignity he could muster before answering. I am a scholar, he said, a historian who has spent 50 years documenting the cultures 100 worlds. Xerath laughed, a harsh sound that held no warmth. A collector of stories, he sneered. A keeper of dust and memories. What use is knowledge without the strength to defend it? He moved on to the next prisoner and the next, cataloging their weaknesses with cruel precision. And when he reached Ambassador Thelix, he stopped and stared at her for a long moment. "The diplomat," he said finally. "The one who believes that words can accomplish what swords cannot. Tell me, Ambassador, do you still believe your speeches will save you?" Thalix met his gaze without flinching. "I believe that empires built on cruelty always fall," she answered calmly. "And I believe that you will learn this truth before the end." For a moment, something flickered in Zyrath's eyes, something that might have been respect or might have been anger. But then he simply smiled and turned away. "Separate them," he ordered his guards, "and rank them by strength, because tonight we begin the demonstration." The guards moved efficiently, pushing and prodding the prisoners into different groups based on their size and apparent physical condition. And the elderly scholar was placed at the front of the first group along with other individuals, deemed weak or useless from the shadows of a side chamber. Sub-Commander Rethus watched the proceedings with troubled eyes. He had served under Zyrath for 15 years and had witnessed countless acts of brutality in that time. But something about tonight felt different. Something felt wrong. The execution of prisoners was nothing new. But there was a theatrical cruelty to this display that made even his hardened stomach turn. "You seem disturbed, Rethus," a voice said from behind him. And he turned to find one of Zyrath's advisors watching him with suspicious eyes. "I am merely observing," Rethus replied carefully, keeping his expression neutral, as the commander would expect of his second. The advisor studied him for a moment longer before moving away, and Rethus returned his attention to the hall while silently wondering if there might be another path forward, far from the fortress, hidden in a rocky canyon several miles away. The Alliance rescue team had made landfall and was preparing for their approach. Lieutenant Price studied the holographic map projected from her wrist device while the other soldiers checked their weapons and equipment around her. "The fortress is heavily defended," she announced, pointing to the glowing representation of the structure. "And our scans show at least 300 Keleth warriors inside, plus automated defense systems and patrol routes that cover every obvious approach." Sergeant Drake leaned forward to study the map with a frown. "What about the not-so-obvious approaches?" he asked, surprising Danny by actually contributing something useful. Price manipulated the display to show a network of thin lines running beneath the fortress. "Maintenance tunnels," she explained. "Built decades ago, when this structure was a mining facility. Most of them have been sealed or collapsed, but a few still connect to the lower levels." Danny moved closer to examine the tunnels, his tactical mind already working through the possibilities. "Those passages are narrow," he observed. "Too narrow for anyone in full combat armor. But someone smaller might be able to navigate them." The implication hung in the air, and several soldiers turned to look at Danny with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright disbelief. "You cannot be serious," Drake said with a snort. "You want to send the medic crawling through tunnels while the rest of us do the real fighting?" "I want to get those prisoners out alive," Price cut in sharply. "And if Cole can reach the interior while we create a distraction at the main entrance, he might be able to disable their security systems or find another way to help." Danny felt the weight of every stare in the group, the doubt and the dismissal and the barely concealed contempt. But he also felt something else burning in his chest. This was his chance, his opportunity to prove that he was more than just a liability to be protected. "I can do it," he said quietly. "And I will do it. Just tell me what you need." Price nodded once, her eyes showing something that looked almost like pride. "Get inside. Assess the situation, and if you find a way to even the odds, take it," she instructed. "We move in 3 hours." Danny returned to his equipment and began selecting what he would need for the infiltration, choosing items that were light and quiet and might serve purposes beyond their intended functions. His medical kit contained dozens of compounds and chemicals, substances meant for healing that could be combined in other ways if necessary. Lies appeared beside him with a worried expression. "You know this is crazy, right?" his friend asked quietly. "Probably," Danny admitted with a small smile. "But crazy might be exactly what we need." 3 hours later, as the twin moons of the fortress world rose above the horizon, Danny Cole began his solitary journey into the darkness, leaving behind the safety of the group and heading toward a fortress full of enemies who had no idea he was coming. His leg ached with every step, a constant reminder of the weakness everyone saw when they looked at him. But Danny had long ago learned that true strength had nothing to do with how fast you could run or how much you could carry. True strength was about refusing to give up, and that was something he had in abundance. The maintenance tunnel was barely wide enough for Danny to squeeze through, forcing him to crawl on his hands and knees through decades of accumulated dust and debris. His injured leg protested with every movement, sending sharp jolts of pain up his spine. But he gritted his teeth and kept going because there was no other choice. The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, and Danny navigated by the dim light of a small device strapped to his wrist. Its beam barely strong enough to illuminate a few feet in front of him. He had been crawling for nearly an hour, and according to his calculations, he should be approaching the fortress interior very soon. The irony was not lost on him that his small size and slow pace were actually advantages here. A larger soldier would never have fit through these passages, and a faster one might have made noise that attracted attention. But Danny moved like a shadow, patient and deliberate, using his supposed weaknesses as strengths above him. Through the stone ceiling, he could hear the distant sounds of the fortress, footsteps and voices and the occasional clang of metal on metal. He was close now, very close, and he paused to check his medical kit one more time, running through the mental inventory of what he carried back in the Great Hall. Commander Zyrith was preparing for his demonstration, and the assembled Calith warriors watched with eager anticipation as the first prisoner was brought forward. The elderly scholar stood alone in the center of the chamber, his chains removed but his freedom meaningless with hundreds of enemies surrounding him. "This one," Zyrith announced to the crowd, "represents everything weak about the Alliance. A creature who spent his life collecting stories instead of creating strength. A parasite who survived by attaching himself to the accomplishments of others." The old man said nothing, simply standing with quiet dignity as Zyrith circled him like a predator preparing to strike. In the Calith way, the commander continued, "Such weakness would never be permitted to exist. And tonight we will correct this mistake of nature." He drew his ceremonial blade, a curved weapon that gleamed with deadly beauty in the torchlight, and the warriors began to chant in their guttural language. Ambassador Thelix watched from her place among the other prisoners, her hands clenched into fists at her sides as she struggled against the guards holding her. "You will gain nothing from this murder," she called out, "except the hatred of every civilized species in the galaxy." Zyrith paused and turned to face her with an amused expression. "Hatred?" he repeated with a laugh. "I welcome their hatred because fear follows hate, and fear is the foundation of true power." He raised his blade above the scholar's head, and the old man closed his eyes, preparing for the end. In that moment, Danny finally emerged from the tunnel into a small storage room filled with crates and equipment, and he took a precious few seconds to catch his breath and assess his situation according to the facility maps he had studied. He was somewhere in the lower levels of the fortress, not far from the power generators that kept the building running. He could hear the ceremony happening somewhere above him, the chanting and the speeches carrying through the stone corridors. And he knew he did not have much time. Moving quickly but quietly, Danny slipped out of the storage room and made his way through the dimly lit hallways, pressing himself against walls and ducking into shadows whenever he heard approaching footsteps. His medical kit bounced against his hip with every step, and an idea was forming in his mind. A desperate plan that might be crazy enough to work. He found the ventilation control room exactly where the map said it would be. A small chamber filled with pipes and machinery that regulated the airflow. Throughout the entire fortress, Danny opened his kit and began pulling out vials and containers, arranging them on the floor as he ran through the chemical formulas in his head. During his training, one of his instructors had mentioned a theoretical compound, a mixture of common medical substances that could create a powerful sedative gas when combined correctly. The instructor had called it a curiosity, an academic exercise that had no practical application. But Danny had always wondered if it might be useful someday. Now he was about to find out, working with hands that remained steady despite his racing heart. Danny began mixing the compounds with precise measurements, combining substances that were harmless on their own but became something entirely different when brought together. The resulting liquid was clear and odorless, and Danny carefully poured it into the main ventilation intake, watching as it was drawn into the system that carried air throughout the fortress. It would take several minutes for the compound to disperse, and Danny could only hope that he had mixed it correctly and that it would affect the callous physiology the way he predicted. Back in the Great Hall, Xyrith had lowered his blade after deciding to prolong the anticipation, savoring the fear in the room like a fine wine. Perhaps I have been too hasty, he mused, walking away from the scholar and approaching Ambassador Thelix instead, because I realize now that killing the physically weak first sends the wrong message. He stopped in front of the ambassador and studied her with his 4 unblinking eyes. You are the true weakness here, he declared. A creature who believes that talking and negotiating can replace strength and action. A parasite who survives by convincing the strong to protect you. The guards released Thelix and shoved her forward into the center of the chamber, and she stumbled but managed to keep her feet. Diplomats are the greatest weakness of all, Xyrith announced to his warriors, because they convince societies that peace is possible, that enemies can become friends. That strength can be set aside in favor of words. He raised his blade again, and this time there was no hesitation in his movements. Let this be the message we send to the galaxy, he declared, that the Kelith do not negotiate, do not compromise, and do not tolerate weakness in any form. The blade began its downward arc, and Thelix closed her eyes. Then several things happened at once. The main doors of the Great Hall exploded inward as Lieutenant Price and the rescue team launched their diversionary attack, filling the entrance with smoke and weapons fire. Kalith warriors turned to engage this new threat, and chaos erupted as soldiers on both sides began fighting. But more importantly, the ventilation system finally delivered Danny's chemical mixture throughout the hall, and the sedative gas began to take effect on the Kalith warriors. They did not collapse immediately because their alien physiology was resilient, but their movements became sluggish and their reactions slowed, giving the Alliance soldiers a critical advantage in the confusion. Xyrith's blade missed its target as he stumbled, the gas affecting even his enhanced body, and Thelix rolled away from him. Scrambling toward the other prisoners, Danny emerged from a side corridor into the Great Hall, having followed the sounds of battle from the lower levels, and he saw Commander Xyrith struggling to maintain his balance, saw the opportunity that his desperate gamble had created. The small medic with the bad leg stepped forward into the torchlight, a surgical knife from his medical kit clutched in his hand, and for the first time, Xyrith Vorm looked at him with something other than contempt. It was not fear. Not yet, but it was surprise. And that was a start. Who are you? The commander demanded. His words, slightly slurred from the gas. Danny did not answer immediately, instead watching the massive warlord carefully and waiting for the moment when the sedative would weaken him. Just enough. I am the one you would have killed first, Danny finally said. The weakest soldier in the Alliance, and I am going to show you exactly what weakness can do. The news spread across the galaxy like wildfire, carried by every communication channel and broadcast on every station that could receive the signal commander Zereth Vorn, the butcher of the Kethian colonies, the most feared warlord in the Kelith Empire, had been defeated and captured. But it was not the capture itself that shocked the galaxy. It was how it had happened. A human soldier with a bad leg and a medical kit had brought down a conqueror who had destroyed entire worlds. And no amount of Kelith propaganda could hide this truth from the billions of beings who heard the story on the transport ship carrying the rescued prisoners back to Alliance space. Danny sat in the medical bay having his wounds treated by another medic while Lieutenant Price stood nearby, with her arms crossed. "You should be the one treating injuries," the lieutenant said with a hint of amusement. "Not receiving treatment." Danny winced as the medic applied antiseptic to the cut on his arm. "I thought I might take a day off from work," he replied with a tired smile. Considering recent events, Price nodded and was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "What you did back there was either the bravest thing I have ever seen or the most foolish," she said. "And I am still trying to decide which. Can it be both?" Danny asked. A genuine laugh escaped the lieutenant, something Danny had never heard from her before. "I suppose it can be," she admitted. "And I suppose I owe you an apology as well." Danny looked at her with surprise. "For what?" "For doubting you, even a little," Price answered honestly. "Because when I put you on this mission, part of me expected you to stay in the back and just patch up the wounded. I did not expect you to single-handedly turn the tide of the entire operation." Before Danny could respond, the door to the medical bay opened and Ambassador Thelix entered, her blue skin slightly pale from her ordeal, but her eyes bright with gratitude. "I was told I could find my rescuer here," she said, approaching Danny with a formal bow that was clearly a gesture of great respect in her culture. "And I wanted to thank you personally for saving my life and the lives of my people." Danny felt his face flush with embarrassment. "I was just doing my job," he mumbled. Uncomfortable with the attention, Thelix shook her head firmly. "No," she disagreed. "Your job was to provide medical support for the rescue team. What you did went far beyond that. And I've been a diplomat long enough to know the difference." She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle but meaningful. "You showed the entire galaxy something important tonight," she continued. "And your example will give hope to everyone who has ever been told they are too weak, too small, or too broken to make a difference." The transport arrived at the Alliance capital 3 days later, and Danny found himself surrounded by crowds and cameras and reporters, shouting questions from every direction. He had never been comfortable in crowds, and the overwhelming attention made him want to retreat to the quiet safety of his medical station. But Lieutenant Price stayed by his side, guiding him through the chaos toward the Great Hall, where a ceremony was being held in honor of the rescue team. Admiral Catherine Walsh stood at the podium, a distinguished woman with silver hair and a row of medals on her chest that testified to decades of service. "Today, we honor the heroes who risked their lives to save Ambassador Thelix and her convoy," the Admiral announced to the assembled dignitaries and media. "But I want to give special recognition to one soldier in particular." She gestured for Danny to approach the podium, and he walked forward on legs that felt unsteady. Not from his old injury, but from nerves. Corporal Danny Cole, Admiral Walsh declared, displayed extraordinary courage and ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. And his actions not only saved the lives of the hostages, but dealt a significant blow to the Kelith Empire's leadership. She turned to face Danny directly. "It is my honor to present you with the Alliance Star, the highest award for valor that the Galactic Alliance can bestow." The Admiral pinned the medal to Danny's chest, and the audience erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. When the noise finally died down, the Admiral leaned closer and asked quietly, "Is there anything you would like as a reward?" Corporal, within reason, of course. Danny thought for a moment, thinking of all the things he could ask for, promotions and postings and privileges that would change his life forever. But then he thought about his medical station, about the soldiers who needed his help, about the work that still needed to be done. Better medical supplies for my unit, he answered simply, because we are always running low on the good stuff. Admiral Wash stared at him for a moment before letting out a surprised laugh. I think we can arrange that, she said with genuine warmth after the ceremony. Journalists surrounded Danny with questions about his experience, asking him to describe the battle and explain how he had defeated Zythone. Reporter pushed through the crowd with an eager expression. Corporal Cole, how did you find the courage to face Commander Zyrith alone, knowing you were outmatched in every physical way? Danny considered the question carefully before answering. Courage is not about being stronger or faster or more powerful than your enemy, he said slowly, because courage is about choosing to act even when everything inside you is telling you to give up. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Humans learned a long time ago that our greatest strength was never in our bodies, he continued, because we are not the fastest species or the strongest species. But we survived and thrived because we learned to think, to plan, to work together, and to never stop getting back up. The reporter scribbled notes furiously. And Commander Zyrith? She pressed. Do you have anything to say about his philosophy of strength? Danny shook his head sadly. Zyrith believed that the strong deserved to rule and the weak deserved to die, he answered. But he never understood that true strength has nothing to do with muscles or weapons or the ability to destroy. True strength is about the will to protect, to heal, to build, and to keep going when everything seems impossible. He looked directly into the camera, and that is something humans will never stop doing. A week later, Danny returned to his medical station on Vera 7. The same dusty tent where he had started this journey. New recruits had arrived during his absence, and they watched him walk past with wide eyes and whispered conversations. One young soldier worked up the courage to approach him as he was organizing his supplies. Sir, she said nervously, is it true what they say about you, about how you defeated Commander Zyrith? Danny smiled, checking his medical kit one more time to make sure everything was in its proper place. Maybe later I will tell you about it, he said kindly. But right now I have patients to see. He walked toward the rows of cots where wounded soldiers waited for his help. His limp as pronounced as ever, but his steps filled with a quiet confidence that had not been there before the galaxy had called him a hero. But Danny knew the truth. He was just a medic with a bad leg who refused to give up, and that had been enough to change everything.